Hello and welcome back to the second episode of the Global Weekly podcast, your home for in-depth strategic, geopolitical and financial insights. My name is James Robert Loughton, the Editor-in-Chief for Global Weekly, and today I'm joined by Munro Waller, one of our editors and international affairs analysts for the platform. On this episode, Munro and I will be discussing the upcoming European Union election, the emerging role of right-wing forces in the European Parliament, and discussing generally how the far right in Europe has transformed in recent years.
Certainly. Last week's first episode featuring Hassan and Toby was an incredibly exciting first step in Global Weekly's new direction, and this year we're working to evolve into a multimedia platform. While article writing has always been at the core of Global Weekly, as our team grows and we reach new audiences, we're always looking for new ways to expand our content. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of today's episode. Last week's episode was met with fantastic feedback, and we're really looking forward to hearing our audience's views on today's topic.
Absolutely. It's an exciting time for the platform. So today's episode, we're going to be discussing the upcoming European Union election. And I think before we get into that, it's interesting to just provide our readers with some context for how the European Parliament works, the different factions involved, and why this election is so important, not just for this year, but I think for the future of the European Union. So I think to begin with, let's talk about the two primary factions that are of our interest today, and that is Identity and Democracy and the European Conservative and Reformists. These two groups are on track to become the largest factions. Some polls right now are suggesting that they could take as much as 30% of the MEP seats. Could you just give us some context on why these factions are different to Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Liberals?
Yeah, certainly. So these sort of factions are much more outspoken in their beliefs to do with immigration, to do with identity. They don't really abide by the traditional rules when it comes to what is sort of allowed to be spoken about. And then also they've attracted certain more radical figures who were sort of peripheral in national politics, but now are coming to the fore, such as Le Pen, such as the more. As a result, they sort of have been able to mobilise a new support base, which previously wasn't really represented in the Parliament. And so what we're seeing here is quite a big change in the EU politics generally.
Certainly. I think the European Parliament, as a pluralistic democracy, has always been a mosaic of ideologies ranging from the far left to the far right. However, what we've always seen in parliaments up until now is what you'd call a grand coalition. Similar to the cartel party theory, where you have large establishment parties that, despite their ideological differences, will cooperate. Those three have been the European People's Party, representing Christian Democrats and moderate social conservatives, the Socialists and Democrats, as the name suggests, representing the centre-left, and Renew Europe, which was formerly the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, representing centrist, free market liberal interests. These three groups have always ruled as the Grand Coalition, and together they've historically dominated both the European Parliament and EU politics in general. The European Parliament's always been seen as a bastion of, I would say, centrist establishment politics. There are some other groups, other notable factions. I would say the Greens EFA Alliance. This is representing a coalition of green, regionalist and pro-European federalist parties that are largely aligned with centrist values. And then also the left, which groups together democratic socialists and communists representing the far left elements of European politics. Where I would say Identity and Democracy and the ECR differ from these two groups is the sudden change in popularity that these two have received since the past election. Could you just talk a little bit about how these groups were formed and how they're going to dominate the next election if today's polls are accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ID is a manifestation of far-right cooperation within the European Parliament, which is pretty new. So it was formed in June 2019 by Le Pen's French National Rally, Salvini's Italian Liga, and the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, and some other smaller forces as well. And it evolved out of a history evolved out of the Europe of Nations and Freedom faction, which was itself a continuation of smaller alliances. So we've sort of seen this growth going forward and culminating in the idea at this point. So it's not like it's sort of unfounded or doesn't have a historical basis here, but the scale of it is definitely remarkable. And it was very fringe. So factions which have come into the ID were previously very fringe, not particularly like influential at all. But now actually it's thought that they could claim as many as 98 seats in the European Parliament, up from its current 58, and only 36 seats from before it was the ID. So it's a huge jump there.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see that jump. After the 2014 election, this group only had 36 seats. They were seen as being on the fringe of politics. We had this idea of an exclusionary zone, which was used to prevent them from ever coming into policy making. The major factions within the European Parliament maintained what was called a sanitary cordon sanitaire, where the policies would be decided internally, and these fringe groups on the right were actively blocked from ever cooperating. And when you have 36 seats in a parliament with over 700 seats, that's very easy to maintain. However, polls suggest that Identity and Democracy are now going to claim as many as 90 seats. And this isn't just exclusive to the European elections. These forces are gaining incredible momentum across Europe. We see that Salvini, although he has, I would say, been outcompeted by Meloni, he still represents a significant force of Italy, still in the governing coalition. Le Pen is, the polls, they're always changing, but they're suggesting that she may overtake Macron in the next election. AfD have become the third largest force. And beyond that, we're also seeing Wilders, who just won the Dutch election. Chega in Portugal have evolved very quickly. This is a momentous change across all of Europe. And so to have what was once seen as the fringe right, the extreme, become potentially the largest opposition. This is a shocking change for the liberal establishment.
So I think that's also really interesting, because that just has simply never really happened before. And as you said, there was an assumption that these groups would be just completely left out of the decision-making process within the EU, and that their views were just unthinkable. And now, because of the level of support that they're getting, that's becoming increasingly impossible. And while it has been said recently that their views won't really be represented, even by the moderate coalition, it's going to be increasingly impossible to do that. So we've seen this problem as well in Germany, for instance. So with the AfD's becoming, I think it's currently sitting at the second largest party, if not the largest.
I think currently it's the third largest. Yes,
third largest. Yeah,
it's grown an incredible amount.
Well, that's so. The established parties there have not really been able to deal with this. And in Germany, there's been a history of banning more radical parties, or right-wing parties especially. And in this case, it really poses a really big problem, because you can't ban a party which has this much support. It's just not politically feasible. You'd end up with an incredibly disenfranchised population. So clearly these parties which were previously radical, and we're seeing this in the EU election as well, are picking up on something that isn't being represented by the traditional moderate parties. And the question really is, are these people being radicalized and are taking views which are dangerous, or are they representing views which are simply actually just not being heard? And that's a really interesting question. And so the question really there is should the moderates be responding to this by absorbing and listening to this group, or should they be actually, as they've been trying to do, sort of pushing them away? But it's kind of impossible for them to confront it in the way that they have been doing it, with the results coming in now.
I think the radicalization aspect is really fascinating. We've talked about Identity and Democracy, which certainly of all the factions are the furthest to what we would call the far right. The other faction that has grown in significant popularity is the European Conservative and Reformists. And I think it's important to look at their history to see how much that they've changed in the past 5 years since the last election. So the ECR, they were originally formed by the British Conservatives. David Cameron was their largest proponent, pushing for a new group in the EU Parliament. And he sought to form an alliance with eurosceptic moderate parties, such as the Czech Civic Democratic Party. As an alternative to the EPP, figures such as Merkel at the time were seen as being blamed for the EU migrant crisis. And so many conservatives within the European Union wanted some form of moderate alternative. With Brexit, the British Conservatives left the European Parliament, and so their influence was, I would say, replaced by Polish Law and Justice, who represent a far more right-wing Catholic nationalist-oriented worldview. And these were then joined by Maloney's shock victory, where we saw the evolution of a neo-fascist movement turned into mainstream conservatism. And since then, this has only further been pushed to the right. Following the 29 election, we saw Maloney take a leading influence over the party, and through that, she invited a number of groups to take part, including Spanish Vox, the Greek Solution, the Dutch Forum for Democracy, and they joined the ranks of existing populist elements such as the Sweden Democrats. This was further emboldened in 2022 when the Finns party chose to join their ranks. So what we're seeing is what was once a moderate conservative opposition to the EPP has become a populist right-wing dominated force, and this is going to be quite a dangerous element for the EPP to contend to, because this is such a broad alliance. I think what is particularly interesting is this year we've seen Zemmour, a very controversial figure in France. He's advocated for such policies as repatriating migrants, previously seen as a very extreme idea to do. He's now taking a leading force within the ECR. Furthermore, we have groups such as the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, seen as an ultranationalist, orthodox-oriented party that has pro-Russian attitudes. And I think most shockingly would be ELAM, so the Cypriot National Popular Front, which began as a neo-Nazi organization. They branched away from Golden Dawn, which is a neo-Nazi criminal group in Greece. They were invited to the last ECR meeting in January to partake. So, what I really am interested in, Munro, is how has this evolved? How have we seen what was once a moderate coalition turn into this big tent group that ranges from moderates to former neo-Nazis?
Well, I think you got to the heart of it when you were talking about the consequences of Brexit there, because I think what it comes down to is the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom, because of Brexit, has left, and that has basically meant that other more radical influences are now took over that faction. So you had Orban and Fidesz now sort of coming to the front there. Orban indicating in February that he would actually join the bloc after Maloney and Law and Justice invited him. So you see this kind of radicalization, this huge shift in the scale of it. But at the same time, if you actually look at what their rhetoric is, it's much less radical than ID. So they line on their website, for example, is that the European Union is overreached. It's become too centralized, too ambitious, and too out of touch with ordinary citizens, which is very different from the ID, which is talking about Greco-Roman ideals and Christian values and things like that, which you can see that there's a bit of a change there. So it's also worth just tying back in. So Fidesz had originally been part of the EPP, but was permanently expelled in 2021, following years of disputes over concerns that Orban had weakened the rule of law within Hungary. And Fidesz are predicted to gain about 12 to 15 seats, and that would give the ECR a significant boost. But Orban's pro-Russian stance, he's sort of been playing parties off each other a lot. His role in blocking Sweden's ascension to NATO, he's quite a controversial figure in Hungary, I think, although I think he does have a large degree of support, but outside of Hungary especially, he's been seen to sort of preside over this democratic backsliding process, and that's been really controversial. But anyway, so the ODR reacted to Orban's suggestion that he would join by proclaiming it would block any attempt at Fidesz's entry. And the Sweden Democrats threatened to leave the bloc in the event of Fidesz's entry. So again, tying back into this, and there's a lot of elements to that. The Swedish Democrats have been sort of moderating themselves for many years, but originally being a very radical party. And that's tied into Orban's relationship with Russia and the way that he's been approaching the situation in Ukraine.
So what we're seeing is a ideological diffusion. And I think that's really important when looking at the other factions. The factions historically in the European Parliament have always been very defined. The EPP represent moderate conservatism. The Liberals represent liberal values. However, these values themselves have formed what we kind of see as the liberal establishment. Mm-hmm. And so for groups such as ECR and ID that have been on the sidelines for decades, prevented from engaging in policy making, they've developed, I think, this idea of an us versus them mentality. And this is crucial for the ideology of populism, a binary, friend versus enemy. We are the popular will of the people, we're the populists, and the establishment, the elite, they're our enemy. And so to overcome that binary divide, these fringe groups within European Parliament, I think they're a lot more open to cooperating. So you can have groups such as Sweden Democrats, which are historically very anti-Russia. This plays a huge part of Swedish nationalism. They are able to a degree cooperate with other groups that have more Russian-friendly leanings, to a certain extent, of course. The same way that the Civic Democratic Party in the Czech Republic, which is a very kind of moderate conservative party, however, is very eurosceptic, they can collaborate with more extreme populist groups because although they have their differences, there's this shared idea that we're stronger together. Let's form a Big Ten organization, and together we can overcome that to expand all our voices, kind of this a collective interest despite the ideological differences. And I think that is one of the major reasons that's really boosted these groups. However, this can only happen to a certain extent, and that's the reason why there are two factions, ID and the ECR. There is still some core fundamental differences that right now are preventing what we could see as a grand coalition of the right. I think the primary issue that's dividing these two groups is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this represents, I would say, a historical East-West divide and perhaps a cultural divide where we have many on the right that see Putin and Russia as an ally against liberal establishment. And then we have the more historically grounded nationalist sentiments within Eastern Europe where Russia is seen as an aggressor and enemy. And if they're invading Europe, they're going to invade us next. How do you think Russia plays into the role of the far right in Europe?
Well, I think the far right in Europe have taken a really interesting stance on Russia because it hasn't been ubiquitously one way or the other. There's not been, so even Orban has sort of slightly moderated his speech in reference to it and not, but there is a degree to which being sort of a friend of Putin is seen as advantageous because him being such a strong man is seen as quite attractive to some of these supporters, the more radical wings. And I think that's also caused a divide in, as you say, there's sort of the East-West divide there. And I think in somewhere like France, that conflict seems much further away, partially because it is, but also because they don't really have the same history with Russia.
So there's a geographical element to it, a proximity issue.
Well, exactly. And also the scale of Ukrainian refugees. So I think that there's sort of many aspects in which the invasion has really heated up the debate, because also there's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of passion when it comes to this subject. I don't think that it's something that can be talked about in a really moderate way if people feel so strongly that like Russia has a point when it's talking about NATO expansion, or people saying that basically Ukraine. I think Ukraine is seen as this, now being seen as this. There've been sort of references to it possibly joining the EU. I don't think that will happen. I just don't think that's feasible. I think that would completely fundamentally change what the EU is. And also the same with NATO. But I think that sort of language does indicate that there is a great sense, especially within the establishment, the moderate parties, that 100% backing Ukraine, there's no real debate about it. But then on the more radical wing with ID, there is a sense that, okay, we actually need to think more critically about this. This isn't so simple. We can't just support Ukraine. We are so dependent on Russian energy sources. We've got historical ties to Russia. And I think that was quite a big thing before Olaf Scholz came in.
So we see in the European Parliament with this upcoming election, there's a lot of fear about the possibility for a grand coalition. Are the moderate conservatives going to be able to cooperate with the far right? Can that cooperation even happen? Some would go so far as to say, could we see the far right actually be in the European Commission in this ruling coalition? Personally, I think that's unrealistic, and I think we can look towards what figures within the EPP themselves have said. The chief president, Manfred Weber, has numerous times suggested that he would be willing to work with certain far-right elements, such as Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy. However, for him there is a red line, and that is what he calls his three principles. All partners must be pro-Europe, pro-Ukraine, and pro-rule of law, explicitly rejecting any form of cooperation with National Rally, Fidesz, or Law of Justice because of their what he calls anti-European values. And this plays into what I think is a moderation of the far right, especially with Meloni. When she came into power, there was a lot of fear. People said this is the most right-wing government we've seen since Mussolini. She was explicitly called a neo-fascist. Now, the story is very different. She just recently met with Joe Biden. He referred to her as one of America's staunchest allies. And there is this collective idea that whilst domestically she may be on the far right, internationally she's taken a very much Atlanticist, Western-friendly approach. most importantly, explicitly anti-Russia. This idea is now developing. If groups will maintain a pro-European foreign policy, then we don't so much have to worry about their domestic values. And this is what is the biggest divide, in my opinion, on allowing the far right to properly cooperate. And it's also, I think, the most important part in seeing how the far right are going to influence European politics. We've talked quickly about the role of the Tories leaving the European Parliament and the effect that Brexit had. But I think another effect is many of the far right are now very much in favour of maintaining a strong European Union. A European Union that is perhaps not built on the traditional liberal values, however, does have core fundamental unifying principles opposed to what we could see as Russia and China, this idea of the collective East. And that, I think, is evident through Meloni and perhaps Milei in Argentina, both of them using Cold War rhetoric of we are members of the free world. Munro, what do you think when it comes to how the far right has reacted to what is an emerging East-West divide? How is this going to change and influence the far right's role in European politics?
Well, so there's a really interesting divide there because the form that conservatism takes and the form that far right politics takes is completely different in the East as opposed to the West. So you see that there's kind of been a massive trend of far right support within young men and the increasing prominence of female leaders in these movements, which have been challenging these preconceptions that very traditional social values are closely associated with these radical movements. But that is no longer the case. I think that that's been really interesting in the sense that it's kind of identity politics, very superficial identity politics, is no longer really guiding sort of the far right in the way that it used to.
So traditional social cleavages that we would usually associate with the left and right are kind of going out the window.
Which is making them seem more moderate as well. Because if you have a female leader, if you have a gay man as your leader or a gay woman, it makes it seem as though you're much more willing and much more socially progressive than you might be. I think because those values have sort of been adopted and sort of accepted by society at this point, so it doesn't actually come with a social connotation anymore.
So this plays into this idea of Western values taking dominance.
Yeah.
So we can see that some figures such as Geert Wilders, who just recently, in a shocking electoral victory, has dominated the Dutch election, he very much positioned himself as a defender of Western secularism. He sees Islam as the primary enemy, and this, I think, is what we're trying to get to, playing on this West versus East divide. There's this idea that the West holds, I mean, it's in the name of identity and democracy. There is, linguistically, there is an identity which we must use. And these are these ideas of secularism and democracy, which are completely different to what the far right used to represent. The far right used to be very much influenced by religion and kind of authoritarian values. But now we're seeing this collective identity that we're here to defend democracy, we're here to defend our identities, and this is in stark comparison to China and Russia and Islam, which represent these direct threats.
Well, exactly. And I think that what the war in in Ukraine even has done is it sort of created this sort of fortress Europe thing of we have to physically protect ourselves. There's a military aspect there, which has meant that what were previously as a preconception that we're kind of safe here and everything, in the biggest threat is on the inside. That's no longer the case, which I think has played into far right rhetoric because no longer people looking at them as the primary threat. It would be the outside forces, and I think also what getting at there is those threats. So in the West, you might see people like Wilders, and you've seen it with in UK politics as well. It's this rhetoric that actually we're not liberal, but we're the ones protecting our sort of liberal values, and that actually the threat comes from the outside, from immigrants, from people, from foreign agents, and we're actually the good guys here, and these sort of soft moderates aren't protecting these values. That's very different in the East, because in the East there is still, so in Poland, for example, there's a huge, religion plays a huge role, and in Italy as well, so in a way that it has done for a very long time. So that's not really a change, but in those countries, what are now seen as sort of very accepted things, so what are now seen as accepted social values in the West aren't necessarily accepted. So the conservatism takes a very different form. It's much more conservative in the literal sense of the word. It's sort of trying to protect and sort of the established norm rather than trying to protect the sort of newly developed sort of social progressive bastions.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. If we look at historically how the far right has tried to mobilize their audience, it's on a nationalist base. We need to build a strong country. It's very militarist oriented. For Europe coming after the Second World War, this is very difficult to do. People historically throughout the Cold War, although there was a lot of fear regarding the Soviet Union, there was also a fear of returning to this nationalist militarism. I think the Russia-Ukraine war has really changed that. For the far-right parties, but specifically in Scandinavia, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria, they now have that justification to remilitarize, reintroduce nationalist-oriented policies because they feel like fundamentally they are at threat, and there is legitimacy to this because the Russia-Ukraine war is the first kind of major direct conflict to occur on European soil since the Second World War. So this plays into what I would call this complete paradigm shift. And you talked a bit about weakness. There's a perception that liberalism, particularly in the West, is weak, can't defend us. And I think this plays into, once again, what we were talking about earlier, how traditional social cleavages have gone. It's no longer left versus right in a traditional sense, where you used to be able to, pick your lower income, you're from a higher income background, you're male, you're female. We can use those identifiers and say, this is what you're more likely to vote for. That's since changed. I think it's now a new binary divide that is liberal, globalist, cosmopolitanism versus more insular, protectionist, and traditionalist backgrounds. And those two are in direct competition with each other. And that's why I think what we should kind of get onto is how there's been such a shift in values where now even left-wing parties are having what we'd consider traditionally socially conservative values because it's no longer stringent on binaries in the traditional sense. If you could just talk about what has happened in Germany with the split in the left and how we're seeing this socially conservative populist left-wing force try to attract votes from the far right.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. What's been happening in Germany is Der Wegener has basically split from the traditional left, and they're now basically trying to appeal to the far right through a new party called the Alliance for Reason and Justice, which has been focused on drawing support away from the AfD, primarily in Eastern Germany, which has traditionally backed the left, but has recently become a far right stronghold. So obviously there's a historical aspect to that because of East Germany and whatnot, but I think something which I find really interesting in particular is the influence of the Russian language in East Germany as well, and the way that sort of influenced sympathies, maybe because of historical ties. But basically, this new left party identifies itself as a left-wing populist party, and it takes very strong stances against the further acceptance of refugees, and is very skeptical of green politics, and actually opposes the providing aid towards Ukraine, and prefers a restoration of diplomatic relations with Russia. So that's quite a radical stance to take. I mean, the German government's been pretty hesitant on providing aid towards Ukraine, and there's been recent controversies about that, with especially to do with the providing of missiles. But they are taking an interesting stance there because it's making basically the traditionally very right-wing subject, talking about immigration in that way, is now becoming it's not really party aligned or politically aligned in the same way that it was, and it's the arena of the political arena has sort of shifted there, and so they are actually getting a lot of support. So about 12 to 20% of Germans are considering voting for that party, the Reason and Justice Party, and actually as much as 32% in Eastern German region. So that's really interesting. And then also we're seeing the growth of the far right in traditionally, not in countries without a traditional far right.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to look at how elements of the left have been adopting these values. It shows us what you said, kind of fortress Europe, this idea that Europe is under attack. There's a lot of collective anxiety that was almost exclusively held by the right. However, I would say the Overton window, this idea of what is accepted in politics, has shifted so much that policies that advocate for Europe having to protect itself from all these outside influences, that has transcended the typical left-right binary. And I think it's interesting to, as you say, look at countries which historically were seen as anomalies. I think the biggest one is Portugal. Historically, Portugal was under the authoritarian dictatorship of Salazar. In the 1974 Carnation Revolution, this saw him overthrown, and what we saw is a restoration of liberal democracy and moderate politics, and this idea of moderate, sensible, inclusive politics have dominated Portugal ever since. However, this has completely changed in recent years with the advent of Chega. So formed in 2019, the Chega party has exploded in popularity, pulling voters away from both the centre-left and the centre-right. In the 2019 election, it gathered only 1.3% of the vote. However, polls now predict that it could take as much as 17% of the vote in the upcoming snap election. So it seems that the far-right's narrative of reclaiming sovereignty and protecting traditional values is gaining traction, and it's not just exclusive to traditional social cleavages. We can see that even in countries with very established moderate political atmospheres are now shifting towards this anxiety, this idea that we need to protect our country, we need to block further migration, we need to defend culture from alien, what they would consider as alien influences, which can take the form primarily of China and this idea of kind of Islam, an Islamic invasion of our culture.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I think that's really interesting because the feeling of threat is so central to this. So people are much more willing to consider different political ideologies, or so there's a sense that even on the more progressive left, on social issues, there's a feeling that, okay, some ground has been gained here when it comes to social issues, and the threat no longer comes from the inside, it comes from outside forces now. And that's really changed. And I think that's partially because of the moderation in rhetoric by the far right. There's the culture war stuff is not really so central anymore. It's much more to do with sovereignty, as you said, in a way that it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't really focused on that as much. And while there is sort of an identity politics aspect to it, still, I think that's less prominent. And I think that that's sort of become less accepted. And I think because of that feeling of threat, I think people are much more willing to sort of consider the far right, and especially if they're adopting these things which are seen as staples of moderation. So like you were saying earlier, there's the sort of support of Ukraine, support of the EU. All these things are seen as sort of markers that you're moderate and you're reasonable and you're sensible. And that's basically now those values, or not necessarily values, but those policies are being adopted by far right parties. And that has meant that they now look much, very moderate. But then, when it comes to domestic politics and whatnot, they aren't necessarily.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of this paradigm shift in acceptance of the far right can be seen in Austria. Another good example. If we look back to the year 2000, the far right Austrian Freedom Party entered into government, which sent shockwaves across the European Union. What we saw was an immediate response from EU member states to denounce and oppose the government formation, going so far as to have major banks, such as major Dutch banks, actually freeze the assets of Freedom Party members, freezing the assets of a fellow government, kind of what we're seeing similar to what's happened to Orban recently. However, if we fast forward to now, once again, the Freedom Party in Austria has become the largest opposition force, highly likely that they're going to enter into a coalition government. And this is following a trend that we see all across Europe. We've had these right-wing parties traditionally dominate Poland up until recently with Tusk, Slovakia and Hungary. But in the West, like the Freedom Party of Austria, we now see the Sweden Democrats are supporting the Swedish ruling coalition. We see Meloni and Salvini in government, and we see Geert Wilders trying to form a coalition right now. So what was previously unthinkable has now not just become thinkable, but it's become the normality. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting to say, what is this? What does this mean for the future of the European political landscape? Wilders in particular, seen as an extreme figure, he's now said he's willing to drop many of his extreme policies. He wanted to prevent any further mosques being built, wanted to ban Qurans from public spaces. He's now said he's willing to drop those to form this government. We've seen Le Pen distance herself from more extreme elements within the French far right. She's really attempting to moderate the image. Used to be called the National Front. This was then changed to National Rally as an attempt to move itself away from its previous history. What do you think the future of the far right is? Are we going to see a continuous moderation and kind of it emerge into what could become the future of the established right?
Well, I think what's really interesting to consider is, are they moderating, or are they just changing what being moderate is? So especially when it comes to immigration, the language about immigration has really become a lot more aggressive and and in a way that by all parties. And there's an acceptance that it's a difficult issue to broach. and address in the way that it wasn't seen 10 years ago. And that's especially been an issue in Sweden, because there's a sense in Sweden, I think especially, it's not really a country which has historically had much immigration. And Jimmy Åkesson and the Svenska Demokrat, they've basically jumped on that. They were talking about it, and all the other parties weren't. And so they managed to gain a huge amount of support. So I think that's an aspect to it. So, but also it's really interesting to consider how much are these people being, are these parties being moderated by the infrastructure of the state, of the actual sort of established law and order aspect, because they don't really seem to be going head on to that. I mean, they might be populist in the sense that they're saying the traditional parties aren't talking about certain issues, but they're not actually challenging institutions in quite the way they might have in rhetorical terms. So that, I suppose the question is really, if they do get into power, are they going to actually moderate themselves, or is it there's sort of a subtext and an assumption by a lot of moderates that this change in rhetoric and this change in language is just a front, and the second they get into power, suddenly actually, okay, things are radical, things are going to happen.
Yeah, Meloni's been the perfect example of this, because she has I would say, towed the line of what is considered normality in European politics. She's built very close relations to moderate leaders. She's working with von der Leyen on future migration bills. So there is this idea of perhaps the far right isn't that much of a danger. Perhaps it's not really a threat. It's all rhetoric. They're going to get in power, and then they're just going to keep following normality. However, I think there is some danger to consider. We've had shocking news recently where it was leaked to the press that members of Alternative for Germany had met with members of the neo-Nazi party Homeland, formerly known as the National Democratic Party. This was directly formed by neo-Nazis at the end of the war. It represents, I would say, an extreme threat to democracy in the rhetoric that these people use. And we saw that this meeting between very popular members of the AfD, people that have attained a huge amount of votes, discussing what the media have called this master plan to send migrants back following the formation of a government. So I would say, even though we have clear examples of members of the far right moderating their language, there does still seem to be a genuine concern, especially with the more extreme elements such as the AfD, which are going to be jolted into popularity. So how can, I think the real question is, how can the European establishment deal with this? We've seen attempts by courts to use the German constitution, which prohibits neo-Nazi ideology and activism, to actually ban these parties, ban the AfD. The problem with that is every time they attempt to ban them, the AfD just keep going up in the polls. If you're a populist and your idea is the elite are trying to suppress you, every example of that's just going to further embolden your views. Do you think this is the correct way to deal with this?
Well, it's so difficult, because if you ban a party, there's a term in Australian politics which isn't really seen in Europe, but it's definitely applies here, which is called white anting, which is the white ant, goes into a tree and it hollows it out, and then it, completely undermines it. And I think in Australian politics, that is a reference to the Communist Party infiltrating the Labour Party, or whatever it might be. And I think if you were to ban the AfD, then the Christian Democrats are going to suddenly become a lot more radical, because they'll join the party, they'll white ant it, and it will completely change the political spectrum. You can't really ban people's support for something. You can ban the party, you can ban the basis of that support, what they're actually putting it towards, but you can't actually. The problem is really for the government of Germany is that people are holding views that they don't want them to hold. And that's something that you can't really moderate in a traditional sense. It's something that actually is quite difficult within a democracy to sort of address, because the whole point is people's views are supposed to be represented and all that. But what if those views are unseemly and are basically seen as going too far? And that's really interesting. And I don't really know what the answer is for that. I suppose there's been attempts to de-radicalize certain groups, and there's definitely an issue with the internet and young men especially. But also, that's not really necessarily going to work. And I think it's sort of the question of where politics is actually going and its place within the debate here. It's not so much these parties necessarily leading the debate, it's that they're following. And I think going back to what you were saying earlier is, Meloni absolutely has moderated herself when she's come into power, and has been very effective at coming off as quite sort of good statesman, and very effective at navigating these things and talking about issues such as migration in a very reasonable and moderate way, is how it's perceived. But then there are, as you were saying, the AFD tied with much more radical groups, and that's not something that you can moderate. If they came into power, those influences are still there.
So perhaps we're just seeing the natural conclusion of a pluralistic society. These views do exist in society, and regardless of whether people like them or not, eventually they're going to be represented. I think it's important to bring this back to the European election. Even with as far as 27 to 30% of the seats going towards what we consider the radical right, this doesn't mean they're going to dominate. The EPP is certainly on track to win. They're going to form a commission, perhaps with the SD and Liberals again. However, this is going to be severely opposed by the far right. We're already seeing that to an extent now. We've seen the EPP cooperate with the ECR and ID to oppose the Green Deal. We're seeing huge farmers' protests right now. For many people within the European Parliament that are wary of the kind of the establishment order not listening to them, the far right is their natural ally. However, this isn't a definitive conclusion. This isn't an unstoppable wave. We've seen recently in the Polish elections, Donald Tusk is back. Law and Justice, yes, they won the popular vote, but through the combined effort of the opposition, they have been overthrown. And I think it's really important to understand that there's no definitive conclusion for politics. In 2016, we had the same idea that there's this unstoppable far-right surge coming. We saw populism win in America. We saw populism influence Brexit. And people were worried that Le Pen would take over in France. That hasn't happened. I think politics, especially in Europe, it works through these waves, these kind of cycles of popular expressions against the establishment. However, they do eventually dissipate. And I think when we look at the role of figures such as Meloni and perhaps the Sweden Democrats, this moderation, this merging back into the establishment might just be an example of the natural order of politics. There's always going to be a protest, and that protest ends up dissipating.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that there. And I'd say at the end of the day, people will, the institutions will moderate themselves. And I think that's a huge aspect. I think when it comes to green stuff, that's different. But
yeah, I think that's really fascinating. We're seeing almost like a washing out of what we've seen as this green opposition. The establishment itself it's not doing terrible. The EPP is still going to win the most seats. SD is still going to win the second most seats. The establishment is still kind of controlling that order. Instead, we're seeing more of a replacement of the opposition. What was once the far left and the Greens as representing perhaps the youth, now that's being replaced by this more right-wing force. But that doesn't mean it's all doom and gloom. That doesn't mean the establishment for the European Union is just going to collapse out of nowhere. Perhaps this is just as trends in politics swerve and change, populism and kind of anti-establishment political beliefs, they work with that, they change with that. That's the whole point of populism, is to take on the general will of the people. And when that changes, the politics and the rhetoric's also going to change.
I think it's just really interesting to add as well that the German Green Party, which was, as far as I'm aware, the largest Green Party in the EU, was actually, it was changing its rhetoric a lot in the way that's not dissimilar to the way the far-right parties been doing it. So they've been very dogmatic about the war in Ukraine. They've been very anti-Russia. They've actually said some sort of energy policies which you wouldn't expect from a Green Party. But at the same time, that Green Party's been part of this coalition, which is very unpopular because Olaf Scholz is just seen as sort of a bad communicator, and he's not necessarily the most competent chancellor in Germany. And also the German Green Party is sort of tainted by this history where it encouraged the shutting down of loads of nuclear power plants, which were fresh. They were ready to go, and they were shut down because of concerns. This protest movement, and that led in turn to a dependency on Russian energy sources. So that's part of the reason why the rhetoric has been so strong by the German Green Party, but also it's meant that they looked a bit naive and a little bit foolish. And also the green policies generally are just losing their popularity because it's seen to fall on the heads of European farmers, the European sort of marginal groups, and to nobody's profit. And it's seen that within the EU, it's sort of the most progressive when it comes to green policies, but at the same time, we're not the biggest problem. That's China, that's America, and we shouldn't really have to suffer for this. So that's really who's losing out now. I think the Greens especially, that's where the far right's getting their support.
Yeah, so I think just to bring it back into conclusion, what we've talked about I think is incredibly important in summarising and explaining where the far right are right now. this election's coming up soon, and if we are to kind of believe the consistent polls, this is going to be one of the best elections for the European far right ever. And this is because of this collective anxiety that's taken hold of Europe, and this is because the traditional left-right paradigms have been completely thrown off their axis. The migration crisis is still seen as a serious cultural issue. I think for many people, it was a direct fear instilled in them that their culture is under threat, and this has only been emboldened by further global events, the Russian-Ukraine war. There is this general fear that the establishment haven't protected Europe. They haven't kept Europe in order. They haven't defended the interests of the people, and this is why we're seeing. I think it began with the yellow vests. It's now being seen with these farmer protests. We're seeing people that would usually vote for the centre left, the centre right, the Greens, now coming over to the more extreme elements of the right and populists. And this isn't a coincidence. This is I would say kind of a logical conclusion when you look at how the establishment has failed to appeal to many people within Europe.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this has just been a really interesting topic to cover because people don't really look at EU politics in the same way they look at their own national politics, but it's still incredibly important. And actually, if the far right, and given that the far right do seem to be gaining influence there, it's really interesting to look at the implications of that. And it's been a pleasure to record this. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, so to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Global Weekly. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the shifting geopolitical currents, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now.